Ukrainian forces have made some serious advances in recapturing in the northeastern part of the country. Russian troops were forced to retreat over the weekend from Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Now, Ukraine says they have liberated more than 2,400 square miles of Russian-held territory in just recent days. CBS News foreign correspondent Debora Patta has more on this.
Seizing the momentum, Ukrainian troops continue their remarkable advance. Yellow and blue, pretty much the only colors flying high across this region today, as they win the admiration of liberated towns and villages. Our troops were so smart, said this woman. The Russian soldiers ran away so fast. They planned this really well. When Vladimir Putin declared war on Ukraine nearly 7 months ago, his troops seized massive chunks of Kharkiv. But in just a matter of days, Ukrainian forces have blitzed through Russia's gains, snatching back huge swaths of land. It's a crushing defeat and a decisive strike against Moscow's ability to resupply their forces. Now they can no longer use liberated Izium as a strategic hub. They left all their explosives and ammunition here, said this Ukrainian soldier. As the Russian front line collapsed, the extent of a war declared largely on civilians is becoming clear. Hospitals and schools blown up, people killed in their own backyards. Away from the battlefield, hard questions for Putin on state-run television, which usually only pushes Moscow's line in its so-called special military operation. It's either full-scale war or we get out, said former parliamentarian Boris Nadezhdin, and policy expert Viktor Olevich exclaimed in disbelief. You say everything's going according to plan? You really think 6 months ago we planned on leaving and repelling a counter-offensive?
Ukrainians want to believe that the tide is turning in a war that's been weighted in Russia's favor. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned that while the counter-offensive was well planned and had clearly benefited from Western military aid, it was too early to predict an outcome.
Debora Patta, thank you. Let's bring in for more on this Hugo Bachega. He's a correspondent with our partners at the BBC. Hugo, the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what are we hearing from the Ukrainian leadership in Kyiv? Is there a confidence that they can maintain the momentum and repel these Russian forces from Ukraine entirely?
Yeah, they certainly feel they've got the momentum, but I think we're hearing some cautious words from officials here. Earlier today, we've heard from the Deputy Defense Minister saying that fighting was still happening in the Kharkiv region, in the northeast of the country. That's where the Ukrainian forces have pushed Russian troops out. And she said it was too early to say whether the whole of the region was back in Ukrainian hands. But first, I think we should, talk about what has happened, because in a matter of days, the Ukrainians have managed to reclaim territory that had been under Russian occupation since the very beginning of the war. And we're talking about dozens of villages, but also key locations, key towns that were being used by Russian troops as military bases. And the images we're seeing from those towns suggest that the Russians had to flee, to abandon everything behind. We're seeing some military vehicles, ammunition, equipment. So the Russians are saying that the troops are redeploying elsewhere in the country, in the east of the country. But the images that we're seeing from those liberated villages tell a very different story.
Yeah, I like that you said that. And obviously, we're getting information from the Ukrainian forces, and both sides engage in propaganda. So sometimes it's difficult to determine what's really happening. And so the Russians are characterizing this as a strategic move, that they are regrouping, but it's obvious this is not their choice. But Hugo, this is what I want to ask you. Why are we seeing the Ukrainian offensive being so successful right now? Does it have to do with new weaponry that it's received, or does it have to do with the weaknesses that are present in the Russian forces?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it is everything you've just mentioned. For weeks, we talked about the offensive and the possibility of the Ukrainians carrying out an offensive in the south of the country, in the Kherson region, which is one of the largest Ukrainian cities in Russian hands. And we saw that Russia had deployed some forces from the east to the south of the country. So it seems that the Ukrainians saw there an opportunity to try to reclaim territory in the northeast of the country. We hear reports that there's been a lot of intelligence sharing between the Americans and the Ukrainians, and obviously the Ukrainians are in this position, in a position to attack Russian troops because of these sophisticated weapons that have been provided by Western countries. And I think it's interesting that last night President Zelensky, in a way, asked for more weapons, and I think this has been the message that's been voiced by lots of Ukrainian officials, but by the president himself, saying that Ukraine and the West must strengthen cooperation to defeat, in his words, Russian terror. So the Ukrainians are going ahead. They feel they've got the momentum, but at the same time, they've been telling Western partners, we need more weapons.
All right, so that's the talk from the people in charge. How are the people on the ground doing, Hugo? What's the air, sort of the feeling that you see as you walk about and speak with them?
I think there is a degree of optimism. I think there is some surprise, and I think we're hearing this from top officials as well, that they've managed to reclaim lots of territory in a matter of days. But at the same time, Russia continues to occupy around a fifth of this country. They have had time to fortify some positions, especially in the south. So it could be the beginning of something. We're talking about, the possibility of a turning point in this conflict, but it's too early to say whether this is going to be the end of this conflict or whether the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out from the rest of this country.
Hugo Bachega, thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to continue this conversation. We are joined now by John Herbst. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. John is also the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you so much for joining us. And Ambassador, you are actually just back in the U.S. after 5 days meeting with high-level Ukrainian officials in Kyiv. Can you share some insights? What did you hear from them? What are they saying that they need?
Well, you heard already from your correspondent some of it. They are determined to reclaim all the territory that Moscow has conquered since 2014, and especially the territory they've conquered since February of this year. They are grateful to the United States for the assistance that they've received, but they also think the U.S. should give far more in terms of more sophisticated weapons, and they're right about that. And they believe that if they receive the weapons they're asking for, which we should give them, they will be able to take back all the territory that Moscow, again, seized since this big invasion 7 months ago, and perhaps much of it that they seized in Ukraine in 2014. Putting Crimea to the side, that's a special question.
I'm sort of curious. The U.S. has given the lion's share of military aid over and above other European nations. I mean, by far, when you look at a graph, it's almost ridiculous. Some of these weapons that they're asking for are very expensive. We're talking about, maybe one shot, a $200,000 weapon. Was there talk in this group about encouraging some of the other European nations to chip in a little bit more? Because it almost feels, or was there concern that some of the other European nations are becoming fatigued when it comes to this ongoing war?
When it comes to military assistance, the United States is far and away the most capable country in the world. We have weapons that no one else has. So the idea is that we would take the lead with military weapons. The Europeans would help with some military assistance as well, but they would then provide even more economic assistance than we have. And that has not quite happened. They promised to do that, and they've been slow to deliver. And that's where they need to do better. But keep in mind this. We passed over $40 billion of assistance laws for Ukraine, and that's a large chunk of money. But it's actually rather small if you understand that what Putin's doing in Ukraine, if he succeeds there, could be a prelude to a Russian attack on our NATO allies, especially in the Baltic states. And if that were to happen, we'd have to send American troops to fight and die. And the economic cost would be far greater than the $40 billion of assistance we are sending right now. But of course, you're right, Europe has to do its part. They've not done enough. They need to do more. But let me say that if we provide Ukraine the more sophisticated weapons that the Biden administration is denying, that counteroffensive that they're conducting right now will be successful sooner. And the economic cost and the cost in blood, Ukrainian blood, will be far less to end this war in a way that suits American interests.
Let me ask you this. Do you think Putin is losing the war? I mean, do you think he's going to start to lose support even from his own supporters inside his country?
I share the caution of people in Ukraine who say it's premature to say that the tide has turned. But this is certainly Putin's third tactical defeat on the battlefield in Ukraine. The first was, of course, his failure to take Kyiv and topple the government in the late winter and early spring. The second was he said he would take all of Donbass, and that offensive, which began in late spring, was stalled by the middle of July, well short of taking all of Donbass. Now the Ukrainians have launched a successful counteroffensive, which is, again, the third tactical defeat, which is why you have at least provincial officials in Russia, talking about the need for Putin to resign. Even the big propaganda shows that are on Russian TV, you have people pulling their hair out about the Russian failure in the light of this counteroffensive. And by the way, one more thing about that counteroffensive. One of the reasons for its success was the Ukrainians kept signaling they're going to push very hard in the south. The Russians moved troops from the east to the south, and the Ukrainians struck in the east. Very clever.
Just very quickly, how concerned are some of the people that you speak to that Vladimir Putin may have no limits, that with each success the Ukrainian military celebrates, he will meet with more firepower, with more troops, and with perhaps unthinkable weaponry?
Let's take each of those piece by piece. Let's start with the last. The Biden administration has an unfortunate habit of saying they can't do X because they're afraid of World War III. That is a very bad look, which does not serve American security interests.
But is it true?
Not just in this crisis,
but is it true?
But in future crises. But let me just finish on this point. The point I'm making is we have to be concerned, obviously, when we're dealing with a nuclear superpower. But we cannot let that intimidate us. We were not intimidated by Soviet nuclear weapons during the Berlin crisis in 1961 or the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We should not be intimidated by Putin's nuclear swagger when we're dealing with a much weaker Russia. So that's the first point. The second point, Putin may well not decide to end this war for years. That's quite possible. But he is losing the ability to produce advanced weapons. That's why he has to beg for weapons from Iran and from North Korea. Western export controls are preventing him from getting the components he needs to make smart weapons. So his military arsenal is becoming weaker over time. Finally, on the troop side, Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine, which is true. But it's also true that the Russian people are not really in this fight. The Ukrainian people are fighting for their lives, for their existence as Ukrainians, against massive Russian war crimes, against genocidal policies. And therefore, every Ukrainian is a soldier. In Russia, Putin is afraid to declare war and mobilize, because if he does that, he'll be mobilizing Russians from the big cities, from St. Petersburg, from Moscow, from Novosibirsk, and that will make the Russian parents much more concerned about Putin's adventure in Ukraine, which right now doesn't really concern them. So this war could go on for a long time, but Russia's growing weaker in the process.
Ambassador, we have about 30, 45 seconds, but I just think about Americans dealing with the Iraq and Afghanistan war, right? And so when you have a U.S. president who says, hey, we don't want World War III, I don't know, Ambassador, what the interest is on behalf of Americans to pressure the president to do more. Your thoughts?
Well, the interest is this. Putin is coming after NATO. He's coming after us. He's coming after the EU. If he succeeds in Ukraine, we may have to worry about a Russian invasion of our Baltic NATO allies. And then we're going to have to send American soldiers to fight there. So we have a vital interest in stopping Putin in Ukraine, just by sending money and weapons, as opposed by sending our soldiers to fight and die. That is why the average American should be in this fight.
There's the argument. Ambassador John Herbst, thank you for your time and
Thank you.
context.
Thank you.